Today is Friday, November 28th, 2025, and we will be discussing the recent shooting of two U.S. National Guardsmen in Washington, D.C., and the aftermath that's developing. Now, the suspect is 29-year-old Rahmanullah Lonkhanawala, and he is an Afghan national who previously served in NDS-03, and that is one of Afghanistan's elite counterterrorism units that was operating under the auspices of the CIA with direct U.S. intelligence and military support. Now, he arrived under humanitarian parole under Operation Allies Welcome and that was initiated in 2021 under the temporary authority used to evacuate tens of thousands of American citizens, lawful permanent residents, SIV applicants, and at-risk Afghan partners. He was granted asylum in April of 2025. He sent his application in December of 2024, and he was granted asylum in 25. And this is kind of some background on his immigration pathway. He had an active SIV application underway and had received Chief of Missions COM approval, but had not yet been granted lawful permanent residence. Now, the SIV program, established under the Afghan Allies Protection Act of 2009 and subsequent extensions, targeted Afghans employed by or on behalf of the U.S. government for at least 1 year in roles supporting military operations requiring a recommendation with a U.S. supervisor, Chief of Mission approval, and exhaustive security vetting to exclude those with alleged insurgent ties and other disqualifying factors. Now, that Chief of Missions portion that he was approved for is a formal positive recommendation from the principal officer in charge of a U.S. diplomatic mission abroad. That is, for example, an ambassador. This approval is a crucial initial step in the application process for Afghan Special Immigration Visa, or the SIV program, which is designated for Afghan nationals who were employed by or on behalf of the U.S. government or related forces. Later on, instead, he applied for asylum. He ended up, giving up the SIV status, and he applied for asylum, like we just discussed, under Biden. But his asylum was approved under Trump. Both his Chief of Mission application and his asylum application required review and vetting by the U.S. government, including the CIA. And we're going to get into the significance of that vetting process as we get into the story. Asylum is a permanent status granted by USCIS after reviewing identity and background checks, biometric vetting, in-person interviews, and assessment of individualized risk and eligibility under U.S. law. And so presumably he went through these processes if he was able to obtain asylum status approval under the Trump administration. Asylees can apply for lawful permanent residence 1 year after being granted asylum. Now, this is a story from the Wall Street Journal. This is an update on the victims of the shooting and also a recap of exactly what happened. And of course, there are some thoughts of mine interspersed in here. So again, from the Journal, U.S. Army this is the U.S. National Guard, one of the U.S. National Guard troops, Sarah Beckstrom, that was targeted by the gunman in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, has recently died. And Trump announced this in a press conference, I believe it was last night. And he showed a picture of the suspect and displayed another photo of people crammed into an airplane in Afghanistan during the botched U.S. withdrawal from the country. This is what we had under the Biden administration, he said. And of course, he's referring back to August of 2021, when the remaining of U.S. troops and personnel left Afghanistan. And of course, a lot of the personnel, the support personnel, translators, and this kind of thing, Afghanis, were also being evacuated as well. And it was really chaotic. And we're not going to get into many of those details, but that's what Trump is referring to. It was the timeline was very crunched. The initial withdrawal was supposed to, I believe, be in May. I assume that's if Trump would have stayed in office, and Biden pushed it to August 31st, which still wasn't enough time to get logistics and all of the requirements for appropriate vetting for the Afghani support personnel in place. So Trump went on to blast the Biden administration for letting Afghans into the country and dismissed a reporter who asked about vetting, and he called her stupid. In the case that the FBI, Kash Patel, and Trump is trying to make is basically that none of the people that came, there were over about 80,000 of them that came into the country at this time between the ending part of 2021. It was the largest airlift in U.S. history, bringing the Afghani personnel and those types out of the country. And so the argument that they're trying to present is that there was no vetting, basically. And this is how this guy was able to get in, even though his administration approved his asylum request. And these are some notes of mine. This is the primary angle, like we just said, that the administration is trying to go with. And of course, all the events leading up to and including the withdrawal itself were disastrous. That was definitely a botched job under Biden's presidency. However, this individual seems to have been complying with all the requirements, like we were just talking about, necessary to obtain legal status, which again, I'd presume is why Trump greenlit his asylum request. And given his circumstances and status relative to our intelligence service, it isn't hard to believe that even under a more structured and coordinated withdrawal, that he wouldn't have still ended up in the U.S. Right? His proximity to U.S. intel and U.S. forces. I don't believe that it was just a short stint. I'm sure that's going to come out later. We'll know a little bit more about his background and what exactly he was doing in Afghanistan, for how long he was working with our personnel. But given those circumstances, whether Trump or Biden was in office, I'm sure that there would have been people that would have had to have left the country. And he likely would have been one of them. He would probably have been prioritized, actually. And the truth is that there were all the indications, even before, at the very beginning of Biden's administration, and before, that the Taliban was likely to re-energize and end up taking Kabul and taking the country over. So a lot of these signs were already there, and Biden came in. And so I don't know that there would have really been a scenario where you wouldn't have had an outpouring of Afghanis from the country after after our troops left the country. So it isn't evident that his being an asylee from Afghanistan predisposed him to carry out the attack, right? He's an immigrant from Afghanistan, he's a Muslim and all these things. It's just as likely that he could have been radicalized here, is what I'm saying. Or there may be a deeper conspiracy involving our intel agencies. That's definitely a possibility. That's kind of the side that I'm erring on, but I don't want to take my platform here and go down too many rabbit holes with that. So of course, this isn't excusing, the murder, but motive is going to be really important, because you're going to have everybody, saying this is a Democrat, this was a Muslim, and so obviously this was going to be the case. Could be a lot more. It could be a lot deeper than that. So unfortunately, when these things are happening, it's becoming increasingly obvious that people are really taking sort of a generic, careless approach when attributing blame. Right? We're not looking deeper into what precisely could be going on. We're seeing more of a topical analysis by many commentators today, where again, it's automatically, well, he's a radicalized jihadist and all of these things. And so, like I said, I don't like the idea of falling into this myopic, shallow argument about, he's a radical and all of these things. Seems like he had a very deep connection with our intel services. Now, the second victim, this is going back to the article, Andrew Wolf, is 24 years old, and he remained in critical condition. You know, and it was announced when the shooting happened that both of them had passed away, right? And then they had to retract it. Again, this is one of those things where it's kind of an exclamation point, right? Why was it announced that quickly? And we didn't even know for both of them. And it's just, of course, it stokes suspicion. We're not going to jump down rabbit holes or anything like that, but it does that, makes you wonder. Now, the death of Beckstrom, who is 20, means that Lakanawala will likely be charged with first-degree murder. He could also face terrorism charges, according to Attorney General Pam Bondi. Now, on Thursday, the Department of Homeland Security said it would halt all immigration requests for Afghan nationals indefinitely. Wonder why they didn't do that before, right? I mean, this administration has been in place for about a year now. That probably should have happened before, in conjunction with all of the other initiatives that they're trying to take to, curb. For them, I guess it's illegal immigration, but you wonder why they probably didn't stop immigration coming from Afghanistan, and also at the same time review all of those asylees that came in under Joe Biden back then. Now, again, hindsight's 2020, but given that the immigration issue is sort of the apex of the Trump administration, you'd think that, I could be mistaken, but you'd think that they would have, taken this initiative already. So, as we just said, on Thursday, DHS said it would halt all immigration requests for Afghan nationals indefinitely, pending further review of security and vetting protocols, and review all asylum cases approved under the Biden administration. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services also said it would conduct a full-scale review of every green card for residents from countries of concern, without specifying which nations. Countries of concern, also Trump has defined those countries as third world countries. And there was a list that was put out, and I'll leave that there. I saw it on CNN, but it's 19 total nations that he's placed on this list. And so we'll see how far that goes. I don't know that that's going to address, the central problem that this incident has raised, but that's what he's planning. Here's some notes from me to give an idea of the scale of the task the Trump administration is allegedly about to undertake. We have to consider a little bit of the history of how the vetting worked under the program employed under the Biden administration that brought many of these Afghani refugees here. Now, U.S. Customs and Border Protection processed over 79,000 Afghan evacuees arriving between July of 2021 and January of 2022, but lacked critical biographical data such as names, dates of birth, and identification for many, including 11,110 records listing January 1 as the date of birth, and thousands using generic placeholders like first name only FNU or LNU, last name unknown. This incomplete information hindered comprehensive biometric enrollment and cross-checks against security databases, leading to the parole of at least 1,299 evacuees without initial biometric data, and 35 who boarded flights with without full green status approved from interagency vetting partners. And I don't know, I don't work for the U.S. government, but I would assume that somebody who is like this guy who was tightly wrapped up with the CIA would have had many of these checks before they worked with him. I could be wrong there, but you'd assume that he already went through a lot of these vetting processes. But the gist of it is that it sounds like it'll be a monumental task. It sounds like, you did have problems in 21 because of how rapidly the U.S. was trying to get people out of the country. But I would wonder if right now the infrastructure is in place for them to be able to properly go through and vet the newcomers and the ones that were already there and do the proper background checks and procedures that would allow them to assess whether they were a threat or not, right? And even if they do all those things, I don't know that there's a guarantee. There's obviously not a guarantee that some of these people couldn't get radicalized here now, like in the present, right? So they could probably do all these checks and use a lot of resources and interagency cooperation to try to figure out whether these people, to assess, whether these people are a threat. Today, the answer could be no. Tomorrow, the answer could be yes. So doesn't mean that again, I'm not trying to say that there's nothing they could do or anything like that. I'm glad that they're, putting the effort in, but, like I said, will it yield the kind of results that'll prevent this kind of thing? I don't know, because this stuff seems too random and unpredictable. You know what I mean? So I'm not at all that confident that this administration has the will or the resources to comprehensively undertake this kind of initiative, especially considering how chaotic our immigration policy has unfolded over the course of the past year. Specifically, the mass deportations. And I don't believe in the mass deportation strategy. I support deportations generally, but deportations by itself are not a strategy it's not an adequate strategy to tackle the larger, deeper, bureaucratic, legal problems of our immigration system. After the implementation of an immigration, and this is my idea, basically, after the implementation of an immigration moratorium, both illegal and legal, for about a decade, I'd say a multi-pronged strategy that addresses first and foremost immigration law, both national and international, UN designated immigration law, and then of course our own country's immigration law down to the state level, followed by sorting out the alleged 20 million that came under Biden. Stephen Miller just went on Fox the other day and said it's not 10 million that came in, it's 20 million. So you have to sort those people out. That would be another great thing. And many of those people did come from Venezuela. But the important thing also to recognize about those people who came from Venezuela is that they did come because much of it was economic hardship. This isn't me supporting immigration. It's just me saying economic hardship driven by a radical sanctions package that Trump put on the Venezuelan government before he left office and their economy. So a lot of that stuff, a lot of those immigrants could have been prevented from coming into the country had Trump have found a way to move away from the conventional neoconservative perspective on Venezuela. But I say all that just to say, hey, a lot of people are focusing on the slogan of mass deportations. And I'd say, well, deport people, right? Try to get, the bad element within the immigrant community out of the country. But a great start to any comprehensive long-term strategy on the problem of immigration in this country, as I just said, would involve a moratorium, cut it all off for about 10 to 15 years and try to sort out the people that are here. That the 20 million seems to be enough to keep any administration busy indefinitely in sorting through all of that, right? So their starting points, I know that it's ambitious, it's vague, you know what I mean? But it might sound impossible, but it's something we should ask. That should be a priority for anybody. A lot of people like to just focus on, deport the bad people. It's like, well, no, we just need to stop at everything right now and try to sort out what's here. And that would involve deportations. That might involve, some expedited legalizations and that kind of thing. But we can get into some of that stuff later. Let's see here. Also, there seems to be a lack of strategy, right? I have no doubt that the administration and DHS have some kind of comprehensive plan, right? And we know that they're allegedly targeting, the most crime, the most violent criminals, and also the people who just break the law by coming over the border. We know those people are being targeted. But outside of that strategy, you know what I mean? Is there something larger? Is there an end goal? Or is it just, every year saying, here's how many people we ended up deporting, hurrah? Tactics and optics have just been sloppy when it comes down to it, right? I know they're getting people out, and I think that many of the people they're targeting, I'm not sure why they're targeting them. Border crossings are down, but some of these people that I've been reading about that they're targeting, not sure why they're doing it. They've been here in the country for like 30 years. They might have a business, or they might be working, and they may, I guess, if they commit a crime, then they're automatically up for deportation. And so that's an unfortunate component of all of this. And so ultimately, just to reiterate, strategy seems to be lacking. And so within the context of this story, strategy and organization seem to be lacking. And if those elements aren't there, if the willingness to take on the more technical, difficult, long-term, issues of immigration, I'm not sure that they would want to, I'm not sure how far this initiative of them reviewing all of the asylees from Afghanistan and running them through the new vetting process, creating a new vetting process and running them through it, I'm not sure how likely that is. I'm not too confident. So continuing with the article, this gets into a little bit of the background of what exactly happened. But Lakhana Wall drove across the country from his home in Washington State. He approached a group of National Guard near the White House and fired several rounds with a .357 Smith & Wesson revolver. Fellow troops engaged the suspect, and he remained in an area hospital under heavy guard. Lakhana Wall came to the United States, is kind of reiterating what we were talking about earlier. In September of 2021, after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the suspect had worked for one of the elite counterterrorism units by the CIA. He was evacuated from Afghanistan by the U.S. military following the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, and arrived in the U.S. on what is known as humanitarian parole, a temporary status that was used to evacuate thousands of applicants for special immigration visas, which we mentioned earlier, the SIVs, and at-risk Afghan partners. Afghans who work closely with U.S. diplomatic and intelligence personnel, including units assisting the CIA, underwent among the most intensive vetting of any foreign nationals. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier, trying to figure out, what's the standard that's used when you have nationals like that in a country that we are involved in working with our intelligence agencies. We're seeing right here, it is a rigorous process that they have to go through. And it just feeds back to the point I tried to make earlier, and that's that if this guy had to go through this kind of vetting, and if he worked with our intel agencies, no matter who the president was at the time, it's very likely that if things precipitated the way they did in Afghanistan and with the Taliban, he would have probably, him among many others that are already here, would have came in anyways, right? And even if Trump had stayed in, would it have guaranteed that the Taliban wouldn't have tried to reoccupy Kabul, right? Eventually, at some point. It wouldn't have been politically expedient for Biden to have just left everybody behind. That was never going to happen. That's ultimately the point I'm trying to make. He wouldn't have done it, and Trump wouldn't have done it. Trump would, of course, say, well, if I was in there, the Taliban wouldn't have taken back over. And we really don't know that, right? And so, let's see. Going back to the article, Afghans worked closely with U.S. diplomatic and intelligence personnel, including units assisting the CIA. They underwent among the most intensive vetting of any foreign nationals around the world as a condition for their employment and prior to entering the United States, said Sam Arnson, a former State Department official who vetted Afghans at the Kabul airport during the August 2021 evacuation. Sounds like he was working under Biden, so there might be a little bit of bias there, but The DHS spokeswoman, Tricia McLaughlin, obviously didn't respond to a question about why the department focused on Biden-era cases if the shooter received asylum after Trump took office. Such a review could include tens of thousands of immigrants whose asylum cases were approved in the previous 4 years, many of whom have since received green cards, which would complicate the process even more. And, you know, this will be something that is scrutinized by the Democrats and many on the outside of Trump's administration. And it's largely because, again, the bed that Trump, the FBI, the State Department has basically decided to, the hill they've decided to die on is this idea of just pointing like right back at Biden in the vetting process. And I think, again, there's some merit to that point, but he did get the status under Trump, right? So were they vetting him? Were they following through with all the procedures properly? So that, I mean, that's going to be something that I don't think he's going to get too much scrutiny over it. And if he does, he'll just ignore it, or I guess, call the reporter stupid again. But, we'll see how that develops. And we'll close out by just me mentioning a couple more points that I made here. And that's that the initiatives the administration is taking to address this incident now are fairly positive, looking to try to review the status and position of a lot of the Afghan nationals that came in, working through different agencies to make sure that the vetting process is up to speed and advanced and comprehensive, whatever it needs to be to figure out who these people are, who's coming in, this kind of thing. But again, hate to be an asshole, this is an initiative that should have already started in the beginning of the year. It's been almost a year since he's been president. And I could give a little bit more charity, but when I see the State Department, for example, over this past year, making a huge deal out of reviewing visa applicants in universities and looking for signs of anti-Semitism or people who protest what's going on with Israel and Gaza, when they're consumed with this kind of thing, it justifies me and it justifies my skepticism. And that's why I think it is appropriate to take a harder line and say, yeah, you guys should have been doing this and not focusing on some university kids in a protest, right? And I'd also argue that this case isn't singularly wrapped up in immigration, right? I'd say it has little to do with immigration overall. The larger cause is the war in Afghanistan itself and the unconstructive withdrawal, starting with the poorly negotiated Doha deal that was brokered in Trump's first term between the administration and the Taliban, leaving the Afghan government out of those negotiations, and of course Biden's ultimate execution of the withdrawal. These are big parts of why these personnel that were tied closely to our intel and our special forces in Afghanistan came into the country. Again, I'll say it for like the third time, there was never a way that most of these people who worked hand in glove with the U.S. government and our intel agencies would have just been left over there to get killed for like certain death, right? And like I said, ultimately, whoever was in office, many of them would have been given access to the country, especially if they were wrapped up, like we just said, in our intel agencies. A lot of them weren't just random civilians. And of course, for those who wanted to talk about this tragedy within the framework of immigration and say that he wasn't vetted properly, whether he was vetted or not, he really shouldn't have been here, right? And he shouldn't have needed to come in the first place. But the U.S. destroyed Afghanistan. So not only are we stuck with the bill, but also tragedies like this, right? I know a lot of people, you hear them on the right wing, well, the vetting was wrong. It was the vetting. It's like, okay, if he came in, but it's okay if he came in if he was vetted, but he wasn't vetted. It's like, no, really, he shouldn't have been here in the first place. If we want to tackle the immigration problem, like I said earlier, my position is that there needs to be a moratorium until, we can figure out what to do with the people that are already here. Right? There were already an overabundance of immigrants here that shouldn't have been here before the airlift in 2021. Right? And so I'm not one of those people that stipulates it on whether he was vetted or not. It's like, he shouldn't have been here to begin with. Right? He shouldn't have had to come here. And again, from an optics standpoint, I can partially sympathize with Trump. But these asylum seekers, these refugees, should have already been reviewed. I would say that over the past year since Trump has taken office, that prioritizing nationals from high-risk countries that have made their way into the country over the past at least 10 years should have been the priority. And it shouldn't be nationals in the country that have been here for like 30 years. And then 20 years ago, they committed a misdemeanor and stole like a stick of gum or something. And then now they have to get deported after being here and starting a business and all these things. The priority needs to be truly, and who am I, right? These are just my thoughts on it. Priority should have always been the things that we mentioned earlier in the video, but also, again, just people that have came into the country over the past 10 years, right? Closing off all entry and just focusing on those people that came in over the past 10 years from high-risk countries, right? High risk doesn't just mean African countries. It means, countries like India and China. Because high risk doesn't just mean the risk of terrorism. High risk also means the risk of job loss for Americans and all the other things that come with immigration. And so ultimately, that wraps up our review of this case. It's tragic, and hopefully, again, there is a sustained effort to, again, review the nationals that came over during the airlift to the best of their ability. Hopefully they will stick to that and stay consistent and intentional about it. Trump has also decided to deploy more troops in Washington, D.C., National Guard. Don't know if that's really going to help at all, because they were there already and this happened. Right. And it's not to make the case that, the National Guard is ineffective or anything like that. I think that they do serve as a strategic deterrent. But there has to be a more bureaucratic, I guess that is the best way to put it, a more administrative, bureaucratic way of addressing the immigration issue in this country. Right. I would fear that the effort to do it effectively would take it would at least take 2 consecutive terms by Trump. Most of the things that he's doing right now are likely going to be rolled back if the Republicans should lose in 28, right? So that will do it for me, and we will see you the next time.